And I guess everything had been said so far on the panel, except by me, so now I'm going to repeat it. But thank you very much for this strategy question, because I think this is exactly key, and my answer would be yes, of course, desperately. What we need in Germany, what we need in the West, is a flexible grand strategy how to deal not just with the Ukraine question, not just with the near abroad as it was called, not just with Russia. What we basically need is a new flexible grand strategy for a European security architecture. And that goes back to my answers to the two questions that you had at the very beginning of this panel. The one was, were the international security order instruments resilient to the breakdown of the bipolar world, and are they still relevant to the current realities? My short answer is no. And the second question is the international community ready to discuss the true, whatever that means, reasons of Russian troublemaking in Europe? And my answer too here is no. So what we have seen is, at least with 2013 and 2014, is an erosion of the European security architecture at large. And this is indeed a dramatic erosion that we do not even discuss in Europe or in the Western Alliance. So what it means basically is what we have seen a weakening of at least three particular elements of the European security architecture. First of all, the OSCE. The OSCE is weakened, I would say, close to a near-death experience. And what we have...
By Russians or by itself?
No, not just by the Russians, not just by the Russians. So it's, the Russians are very often a part of the problem, but in this particular case, they were not the only ones. I mean, we had high hopes with the OSCE when we transferred in 1919 to an organization, and we all believed in the wonderful Charter of Paris. But the first problem occurred very soon when Russia started its first attack internally in Chechnya. So when when with the OSCE, the international community was unable to undertake any effort to get Russia doing something, and that was the first tough weakening point for the OSCE. So then what we had is related to this, I dare to say, that the United States lost their interest in the OSCE to a certain extent. So they left it over to the Europeans and said, okay, this is your business, do it. And what we then finally saw is with the memorandum of the Conventional Forces Treaty in Europe, which is the cornerstone for security in Europe, or one of the cornerstones of security in Europe, should simply leave it into a moratorium so that the Russians can do whatever they want with it. That was another mistake. And when it comes to values, I would say that the Council of Europe, which is considered by the Russians the holy grail of Western values, that's another institution that has been weakened. So not just that we saw a weakening of these fundamental European institutions or for the European security architecture, what we have seen as well is the establishment of an alternative international order or regional order in Europe. And guess what? We didn't even recognize it. We didn't even recognize it. So when it started not just with 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, it did not start with the war in Georgia in 2008. It even started earlier.
93, Transnistria, and then Georgia.
Yeah, see, even earlier. It started exactly with the point when, however you call me, Putin or Russia. So the Russian government officially stated that it on the one hand believes in the Westphalian peace system, which is based on sovereignty, but this is not true for all countries in Europe or in the OSCE. There are areas of restricted sovereignty and we then Western have to understand that this is absolutely necessary for Russian security. So that was the really first thing. So our main mistake was basically not to see this weakening of the European security architecture from the very beginning, when we still believe that we are on a really bright future towards integrating Russia into a European security architecture, into what we consider the Western values-based system, the OSCE system. We did not really realize that the Russians did not buy into it. And that was, I would say, the huge mistake that we made. And we did not see and we did not read carefully or rightly enough the signs at the wall. And I would remind you on this famous speech President Putin gave at the occasion of the Munich Security Conference in, I guess, in 2006 or 7. Yeah? So when the entire audience was completely shocked, what is this guy? I mean, did he took the wrong manuscript from 1950 or what happened? So no, he was serious about it. And he underlined what the Russians had in mind, and that was, I think, not understood, so we simply were taken by surprise. So coming back to the Russian alternative regional order, this is, I think, is an important issue that we need to understand and that we need to better understand, because that relies to our concept, the Western concept of the shared neighborhood. I would say that we never ever understood correctly that the Russians did not buy in that there is something to share. That was one of the biggest mistakes that we made in terms of strategy and in terms of engagement with the Russians as well. The third point in this regard is what I currently see, and that deteriorates the situation even, is that we are lacking a unity in the West. So the West, from my perspective, is very much weakened currently. So it's partly due to other external and internal developments. I mean, we take the European Union, where we do have countries that have difficulties to fulfill the basic values of the European Union, the Central European countries. If we take the how to say, authoritarian appeal that we see in some or most Western countries, as Stefan Birling talked about Germany. You can take France with the Front National, you can take the Netherlands, you can go on and go on. So there is a certain undermining of what we consider to be a cohesion, a Western cohesion. Partly it's due to, not related to Russia, but to the process of globalization and the question how Western society should respond to it. Partly it's due to Russian influence and interference, and I would say the line of conflict moved from Central and Eastern Europe to Western Europe. If I take the Russian interference into the referendum in the Netherlands about the Ukrainian CFTA, if I take the interference in the Catalonian issue, if I take the interference in the Brexit, if I take and I can all go on. So all this brings me to the point that we are desperately in need of a new strategic concept, and that we have to refine and redefine what the West is, what the West means, and what its basic institutions are, and what that means. So what does it mean for NATO? What does it mean for the European Union in terms of its policy towards the Eastern Partnership? And here I think we again made a big mistake. So what the EU currently is preaching and teaching in its strategy, in its strategic concept, is basically be resilient and carry on. And that's shying back from its initial policy. If we are really convinced that democracy, free market economies and open societies is the best way to be resilient and the best way to organize states, then we should come back to this and support the transformation processes in Eastern Europe and in the Eastern Partnership countries. In the moment we went back and simply stated resilience is the talk of the town, we have to ask, what is it? What is resilience? What does it mean? Does it mean survive? You can see here at your hashtag at the very beginning, or what's behind it. And that's why I think we need desperately a new strategy, a new Western strategy. What first of all, what is it? What the West distinguished from the rest, in particular, what is it? What the West distinguished from Russia, and not just that, what it is, an identity question, but as well in terms of policy and strategy for the Eastern neighborhood and for the Eastern Partnership. And final point, strategy is certainly not to let these countries on their own in between. So that's certainly something where we desperately need to go back and reconsider what we need to do. And the final word, this is something that our politicians desperately need to discuss and bring to the public discussions in Western countries. I mean, if I see the discussions that we have had in Germany about the issue, Stefan described it to a certain extent, but I would say it's even worse. It's even worse. There's basically no understanding what's really going on and what are the strategic implications of the current situation in Eastern Europe, and that's absolutely a terrible situation. So, and on that happy note, I would close.
Yeah. Thank you. We had many speakers. I